Stop me if this sounds familiar. You know that having a consistent reading habit is a really good way to level up. So you try acquiring lots of nice books, but they often stay unread on your shelf or your bedside table. Deep down, you hope that the knowledge from these books might be absorbed into your mind by some kind of magic, but sadly, it never does. Well, I've been experimenting with a variety of methods to get back into reading. And in the last 7 days, I managed to learn and apply a bunch of new knowledge from over 20 books. And here's the best thing, it wasn't anywhere near as hard as I thought it would be. In this video, we'll take a look at how this happened, why it's so hard to read like I used to, and I'll show you a variety of techniques that you might be able to use to learn to love reading again. Let's go. When I was growing up, I had an absolutely insatiable appetite for reading. One of my favourite things was curling up with a book. Now, fast forward to more recent years and, well, I basically stopped reading books. Now, don't get me wrong, I love learning new stuff, but a lot of my learning these days comes from YouTube and podcasts and audiobooks and, maybe shamefully, social media. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But these are all things that I can do in little bite-sized chunks around my life as a working professional and a parent. I simply have much less time for reading than I used to. But I sometimes worry how much of this bite-sized learning actually stays in my head. And sometimes in the case of YouTube or X, it often leads to mindless scrolling without any intention. That's probably not a good thing. And with all of these various sources of information and inspiration available, I'm starting to realise why books are usually the last thing on my list to think about at the end of the day. So I miss reading, but also I kind of dread it. Does that sound familiar? Before we look at what I've tried to help here, we need to understand why it's so hard to read. And I'm not talking about reading impairment or visual impairment or any kind of cognitive impairment, but to understand all of this, I'm going to turn to my old pal, neuroscience. Humans have only been reading for around the past 5,000 years, which is nowhere near enough time for this skill to evolve in a way that changes the shape of our brains. And that means when we read, we're using parts of our brains that likely evolved for something else. And because of that, there's limited cognitive capacity to take on a high-intensity, highly complex task like reading. Now, the brain is naturally lazy and it wants to do the least amount of work possible. So with that in mind, if you were my lazy brain, have a think about how likely you would want to work to process this versus processing something like this. It's an uphill struggle. So other than throwing my phone in the bin and deleting all of my social media accounts, what options have I got to help me get back into a habit I used to love? Well, first of all, there's good old-fashioned punishment. Now, the author and podcaster Tim Ferriss calls this fear setting. The idea is that you create a scenario where something that you want to avoid will happen unless you do the thing that you need to do. Now, an example of this would be that if I don't read this book by the end of the week, I've given someone full permission to donate a substantial sum of my own money to the right-wing National Party here in the UK. So maybe this would actually be a really good fear setter for me, but I do worry that this one seems a bit open to being gamed. I could simply lie about doing the reading to avoid this happening, so I'm not convinced that will be enough of a motivator for me. Next up, we have the reverse of this, reward. So there is a habit setting practice called temptation bundling, which is the idea that you can kind of trick your brain into doing something it doesn't want to do by combining it with something it does. I've actually used this technique before when it came to exercise and fitness, and it worked really well. But this presented a problem when it comes to reading, because I realized that when I was thinking what kind of thing I would like to bundle with reading, a lot of things revolved around listening or watching something else, which I can't really do whilst reading. And the other thing I like to reward myself with, as it turns out, is food. And could I really reward myself with a nice chocolate bar every time I read a few chapters of my book? Maybe, but probably not a great idea in the long term. And then I started thinking about getting really brutal with my approach to reading. So one of the things I really struggle with when it comes to reading is what happens when I start a book and I don't really enjoy it or get anything out of it. Traditionally, I would try and push through. There's a really nice dopamine here that comes from closing a book and saying, great, I read that, I completed it. And that thinking comes from a thought process, which is along the lines of, well, I've invested 2 hours into a book that I'm not really enjoying. What's another 6? it might get better. Wrong. This is faulty thinking that comes from a psychological bias called the sunk cost fallacy. We are programmed to carry on with things if we feel we've invested an appropriate amount of time or energy or effort, even though the logical thing to do is stop and do something else. Think about the last TV show you were recommended by a friend where they said, you just have to get past the first 3 seasons and then it gets really good. Alright, so I've got to invest 30 hours of my life in this thing before I might start enjoying it. No, I don't think so. Why don't we do this more with books? And this brings me to the solution I found to help me read more, even though I don't much like reading. I cheat. Kind of. Now, for some time now, I've been using an app called Shortform, who are sponsoring this week's video. Now, before we get into this, I need to make 2 things super clear. Firstly, I was using this before I asked Shortform about a collaboration, and secondly, Shortform isn't designed as a complete replacement for reading books. On the contrary, it's designed to enhance your reading experience overall. Now, in my case, it even had me going back to books I'd already read to help deepen my knowledge. Let me give you an example. Like a lot of people, I'm a big fan of Ali Abdaal, and last year he released his first book, which went on to become a New York Times bestseller. And because I'm a little productivity nerd, I was on his pre-order list, and well, yeah, the book turned up, and it promptly went onto my shelf, where it has remained. I'm sorry, Ali. I saw that Shortform have got a summary of this book available, so I decided to check it out. And you can see there's a 1-pager which covers the main ideas, and then it has chapter by chapter summaries. There's also an audio version of all of this, so if you want to digest it like an audiobook or podcast in between reading or work sessions, then you can. But then check this out. Shortform actually goes further and builds on what's in Ali's book by suggesting alternative viewpoints, and it even fact checks some of the claims he makes. So using Shortform to digest learning from a book feels a bit like being in a book club with someone who really cares about the topic you're reading about. Now you might be thinking, I know you're into AI, Mark, why don't you use something like ChatGPT to do this? Well, you could, but at best you're only going to get a very high level summary, and you won't get those alternate perspectives, the fact checking or the chapter summaries that you get here with Shortform. And anyone who has used ChatGPT will know that fact checking isn't something it's exactly brilliant at just yet. Now when it comes back to Shortform, you can actually use it to summarize all sorts of things, including web pages, YouTube videos, and more. There's a whole hidden AI component that is well worth delving into. And because Shortform is app-based, it works across all my devices, so if I want to catch up on my laptop, I can go into the browser here, or I can listen to the audiobook on my phone when I'm out and about, or if I'm on my iPad, I can grab my Apple Pencil and then highlight little sections, and they get captured in their own little highlights area here in the app. And the coolest thing is that having all of this available genuinely made me pick up his real book and read the parts that I was most interested in. And that, folks, is how I managed to trick my brain into reading books again. If you're interested to try this out for yourself, you can access Shortform via my special link. There's a QR code on screen too that you can use, and this will give you 5 days of completely free access and also 20% off your membership if you decide to go through and take it out. That's basically like 2.5 months of access to this tool that will help you rediscover book-based learning. Folks, if you've got any questions about this one, just leave a comment down in the ding dang doobly. And if you enjoy this one, you'll love learning how I ditched Apple to keep all of my notes in a visual note-taking system. It's just up here. See you next time.